Hi everyone, welcome to the live streaming for spring term. I'm so excited that you guys are here. Um, just want to make sure that you guys can see my screen and hear me. Can you guys please let me know in the chat if you can hear me and see my screen? Awesome, thank you. All right, everyone. Okay, welcome again, and let's get started. So if you have this worksheet, go ahead and pull it up. I'm not sure if the professors put it up on D2L this term as well, but if not, then let me know and I can try to get that for you for the next session. So today we're going to be looking at respiration and how the mechanisms work, why we breathe, and how our body controls whether we breathe really fast or whether we breathe really slow and why that's important. So here on the first page, it's just a really big overview. They're giving us some terms that are commonly used when we talk about respiration. So we have the diaphragm, which is going to be the skeletal muscle right here. And then diffusion is how the gases are going to be exchanged. And with cellular respiration, sorry, not cellular respiration, with respiration, we're trying to remove carbon dioxide from our body and use oxygen. And yeah, so it just has all the big terms that we're going to be looking at. So in the first diagram, we see that there is one for inhalation and one for exhalation. And the important things to note here is what's happening to the diaphragm. So when we're breathing in, the diaphragm is contracting. Sorry, I meant exhaling, not when we're breathing in. So when we're breathing out, and then actually, sorry, hold on. I got this really confused. So when we're inhaling, it's going to be contracting and relaxing when we're breathing out. Yeah, sorry for that confusion, but if something's not clear, please let me know. And another thing to note here is also the fact what kind of pressure there is. So we see that inhaling uses negative pressure, so that means the pressure inside our lungs is a lot lower than the atmospheric pressure. And this is important because air wants to travel from where there's more pressure to low pressure, right? So that's why it's important. The inside of our lungs has a negative pressure when we're trying to breathe in, so it can facilitate the movement of air from outside to the inside. And the reverse logic applies to exhalation. So when we're trying to exhale the air, we want less negative pressure in our inside of our lungs so the air can exit out. And then in the next diagram, they're just showing how the air pathway is in the human lung. So some big anatomy would be knowing that there's the trachea here, and that splits into the two bronchi. And then within the bronchi, um, it splits even more and goes to each side of the lung. So one on the left side, one on the right side. And then they're showing that these little splits, like if you magnify it, you get this thing called an alveoli. And this is where gas exchange is actually going to happen. So that's pretty important to remember that the alveoli is the unit where the gas exchange happens. So we can see that there's oxygen poor blood in and then oxygen-rich blood coming out. We have our capillaries, and this is where the exchange actually happens because the capillary is very thin. It single file lines the blood cells. So each blood cell has like maximum contact. So we see that oxygen from the alveoli film enters into the bloodstream. And that's how we get the exchange. And the carbon dioxide is also released back into the alveoli part. So we're basically exchanging oxygen for carbon dioxide. Can anyone in the chat let me know if they're able to hear or see my screen? Awesome. Okay, sorry about that. Not sure what happened, but thanks for letting me know in the chat because I was not aware that my stream had cut out. So I'm not really sure where I left off, so I'll just say this again. I like to keep this like steps in mind because it really helps me like visualize like from big picture to like small picture. So we're going from like breathing in the air and then sometimes I'm like, okay, like what happens with that air? So just knowing this chart helps me realize that like we're breathing in the air, putting it into our circulation, and then actually utilizing that oxygen in our mitochondria. And then that can be also shown in this image right here. So we're seeing how oxygen is brought in, and then we're using glucose and oxygen to get the ATP that we need. So this is what I was talking about with like the mitochondria, like the cellular level mechanism. So that's where oxygen is very, very useful. And then another thing that I would also like to talk about is how it's very regulated. So you see that it's controlled by the brain, and then we also have a region in our brainstem that's very involved with regulating how our breathing works. So there's stretching receptors, there's irritant receptors, and then there's also different mechanisms to help with controlling like the chemical level in our bloodstream. So what happens if hydrogen goes too high or hydrogen goes too little? So it's very, very controlled and there's like positive and negative feedback loop. So I'm not sure like how much in detail you need to know that, but it's just good to be aware that it's regulated. I seen the comment, it says, sorry, I was just able to join. Is there a form to fill out? Yeah, there is a form to fill out, but I will be posting that in the chat at the end of the stream because I realized if I post it before, like people that come in later can't see it. So I'll be posting that towards the end. All right, so we've looked at like the big picture and like the details of how like why we breathe, but now let's use that information and try to answer these questions. So, can anyone explain to me why we breathe? I know we talked about it a little before, but I would like to get you guys to try answering these questions. What about breathing that's very essential? Comments say oxygen for cellular respiration. Yes, that is very true. That's the most important thing that I was thinking of too. So we're breathing in to supply ourselves with oxygen because you need it for cellular respiration. Otherwise, we can't do electron transport chain, we can't do Krebs cycle or like the oxidative phosphorylation. Yeah, like ATP, we need it for ATP, so it's very important. Let me just quickly write that down. All right, so next we're going to be looking at what factors kind of determine like how much oxygen is traveled, how much it is released in the bloodstream. So we're looking at how does the level of carbon dioxide in the blood contribute to the pH. Um, for this, I think about the bicarbonate like buffer system in the blood. So we see that carbon dioxide plus water is going to be in equilibrium with H2CO3, and then that's going to go to H plus and HCO3 minus. So this is a very useful equation, and I would try to commit this to memory. It gives us a lot of useful information. So for example, if there's a high level of carbon dioxide in the blood, then our blood is going to become more acidic. And we know that from this formula because if this increases a lot, our body is going to try to push the reaction this way just to try to get everything in equilibrium. And if the reaction goes this way, then that means H plus is also going to go up. And if H plus goes up, that means our pH is going to be very low. So that's why we have like the bicarbonate buffer system. So here the body tries to keep it in equilibrium, like it tries not to get the hydronium ions too high, but sometimes if you're like exercising super fast or just don't have access to enough um, oxygen and can't get rid of the carbon dioxide, that's when you get like acidosis. But in like a regular body that's at homeostasis, the body is usually pretty good at maintaining the pH, so it doesn't go too high or too low. Okay, does anyone have any questions about this equation or the concentrations that I talked about? All right, so next we're going to be looking at how does the level of CO2 in the blood affect affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. So we're going to be looking at like how the shape of the hemoglobin molecule changes in response to pH, because the changing of that molecule, hemoglobin, is what's going to determine whether there's high affinity for it or low affinity for it. So at lower physiological pH, the shape causes hemoglobin to give up more oxygen to the tissue than it would at a high physiological pH. So let me write that down first, and then we can talk about why that makes sense. All right, so this is the general trend. At low pH, the body is going to release oxygen more to the tissue. Comment says, isn't it to bind to CO2 instead? Yeah, that's also one of the reasons. So let's think back to part A where we looked at the equation. So if pH is really low, that means we have a lot of carbon dioxide concentration in our body. That's what's causing the low pH. So it makes sense, like the comment says, so it makes sense to grab the carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream and supply it with oxygen instead, because it shows that there's not enough oxygen and there's too much carbon dioxide. So by causing the hemoglobin to release the oxygen more to the tissue, we're able to supply the tissue with oxygen and at the same time remove some of the carbon dioxide that's causing the low pH. And it's also good to note that this is called the Bohr shift. It basically says that at low pH, this is how hemoglobin's going to act. All right, then we're going to look at Bohr shift, so looking at pH, carbon dioxide level, all that, and we're going to try to see if that shift is more likely to occur after exercise or after hyperventilation. So when we're exercising, there's going to increase the amount of ATP required, right? Because we're exercising a lot, we need more energy. So we're using up ATP a lot more than when we're not exercising. And because ATP is produced through cellular respiration, where carbon dioxide is a waste product, so like in the previous slide, we looked at how oxygen goes in and carbon dioxide comes out of cellular respiration, right? So when we're exercising, there's more buildup of carbon dioxide in the tissue. And like we've mentioned, more buildup of carbon dioxide means lower the pHs in the tissue. So again, this causes the conformational change in hemoglobin and it delivers more oxygen to the tissue undergoing exercise than any other tissue. I know that was a lot of words, so if you have questions or if I went too fast, please let me know. Also, I just realized another way you can think about this is hyperventilation is when you're rapidly breathing, right? Which means it increases the rate you're breathing out, and that means you're getting rid of more carbon dioxide. So in a situation like hyperventilation, if you actually breathe out too much, then your carbon dioxide is going to be low, which means hydrogen is going to shift this way, or like the reaction is going to shift that way, which means our pH is actually going to go up a little bit if our buffer system wasn't really present. So that's why the Bohr shift is likely to occur during exercise because that's when we're more likely to have an acidic um, pH than if we were breathing out more. And we can represent this Bohr's shift in a graph. So here, this is kind of the regular, oops. Here is going to be our regular curve for how oxygen dissociates in our blood. And then here we're seeing reduced pH conditions. So the reduced pH condition is right here. And what this is essentially showing is that at normal condition, your partial pressure of oxygen at 40, the hemoglobin saturation is right here. So let's call this 70. But at 40, for the reduced pH conditions, we see right here is at 60. So essentially what that's saying is there's only 60% of oxygen left on hemoglobin at 40 mmHg of oxygen when it's at reduced condition, but there's 70 under normal condition. So like we've been talking about before, this just shows how more oxygen is released at lower pH than it is at normal condition. And then another interesting case that we can look at when it comes to blood affinity is fetal blood versus maternal blood. So here we're seeing that the oxygen saturation of hemoglobin at 20 partial pressure of oxygen is 40 for the fetal blood, but then for the mother's blood, it's only 20. So can anyone tell me what this means in regards to affinity? Is the fetus blood has more affinity to oxygen, or does the mother blood have more affinity to oxygen? Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of comments saying the fetus. Yes, that is exactly right, because that we see at a lower pressure, the fetus blood has more affinity for oxygen in its hemoglobin than it is in the mother. So these are a couple questions relating to the graph. So we see normal versus reduced pH, and like we talked about before, I'm just going to write it down again. So low pH equals more release of O2 to the tissue. And here it's asking about infant versus adult. And like we said, infant has greater affinity for oxygen than maternal hemoglobin. And we can talk about why this is important. So the higher affinity in infant, the reason why it's important is because it allows for the fetus blood to take oxygen from the mom's blood. And if that weren't a thing, like if fetus hemoglobin didn't have a greater affinity, then there wouldn't be a transfer of oxygen from the mom's blood to the fetus blood, and that would be really bad because then the fetus would have a hard time of getting oxygen. And then the next question kind of talks about that too, like what would happen if fetal and adult hemoglobin had the same affinity for oxygen? If that happened, then the partial pressure of oxygen is the same, then the fetus would have a much harder time of getting oxygen and transporting that oxygen. And that would significantly affect development. So it's really important that the fetus blood has a higher affinity. Also, this would also reduce fetus metabolism because we talked about how O2 is used in cellular respiration. So not only is the fetus not getting enough oxygen, but that's going to affect its growth, its metabolism, its ability to make energy, which is pretty much everything you need at that point to grow, right? All right, next, we're looking at a little scenario. It says, if they don't get what they want, some small children threaten to hold their breath until they die. Children who are very strong-willed may turn blue, but they will not die because they will pass out. An autonomic breathing response will take over. And we're trying to look at what types of control are involved in this. So we're seeing that, so the child is holding their hand and like holding their breath and saying that they're just not going to breathe. And when they do that, the carbon dioxide in their blood level is going to increase. And this is going to change the blood pH, right? And if you remember from the beginning, we looked at how there's like pathway control between the brain, brainstem, and heart and lungs. So it's highly regulated. And basically, when that happens, when the carbon dioxide level are too high and the pH is low, what happens is there's a signal sent to the medulla of the brain. And if the medulla gets that signal that carbon dioxide is really high, then the medulla is going to trigger a response that causes you to pass out. And when you pass out, you're under involuntary control, right? And breathing, you you can control it yourself. Like you can breathe in and out, but then a lot of times when we're not thinking, breathing is pretty automatic and involuntary, right? So that's why like the brain like causes you to pass out, so it can like continue involuntary breathing and you can't like hold it against your will. So that's like one way of doing that, and I just think that's like super cool how our like body has all these different mechanisms to help us. Um, so I'll quickly write that down here. So one way it can happen is high CO2 levels sends signal to the medulla, and then medulla causes you to pass out, and this restores involuntary breathing. Another thing we can think about is what happens when we're hyperventilating, so like the opposite. So in case one, there's like too high CO2, and then this is too little. So when we're hyperventilating in this scenario, we're going to reduce the carbon dioxide level in the blood, and that's going to increase our pH. And this is also like recognized by the medulla, and the involuntary breathing is reduced or at times even completely stopped. And if you try to like force hyperventilating, again, like you can reduce the carbon dioxide level. Um, it causes like your peripheral arteries to constrict. So even though you're like hyperventilating, your body has constricted your blood vessels, so not much carbon dioxide is leaving. And this and another reason why this helps is because when it constricts that, there's going to be too little of blood flow to your brain. Um, and essentially what that does is causes you to pass out again. And when you pass out, then the autonomic involuntary breathing by the medulla takes over. So basically what your brain is doing is if you're holding in your breath or if you're breathing too much and you're just fighting it, like you're just not letting your body do its job and you're trying to go against it, then basically your medulla is just like, all right, I'm gonna knock you out and then we're gonna do involuntary breathing. All right, that was our last question. And if you have any questions about what we talked about today, please let me know. Or if you have any thoughts or comments. All right, I'll go ahead and put the attendance form in the chat. Please make sure to fill it out and so you can get extra credit. Comment says this made the chapter more sense. Thank you. Yeah, no problem. Thank you for coming. Yeah, while you guys are filling it out, I would just again reinforce that the equation that we looked at here on question 2, I would say this is very helpful. Like if you understand that equation and what happens when one thing is higher or lower, then I feel like you'll be in like a great shape to answer any of these hypothetical questions about hyperventilating or acidosis. The PogChamp sticker is my favorite. All right, guys, again, make sure to fill out the form. I'm going to end the stream now. I hope to see you guys next week.